It commenced during one typical warm afternoon when Josh realized he was solitary in the residence with no particular plans whatsoever. None of his companions resided near enough to socialize with, and traveling to the shopping center would necessitate someone transporting him there. Petite and structured, quite similar to his mother, he had received nearly every one of her bodily characteristics. They possessed roughly identical overall proportions, and it appeared as though his development had simply reached a definite standstill. His father had departed several years prior in a sorrowful mishap, leaving sufficient protection funds and wisely handled investments that permitted them to exist quite comfortably without monetary pressure. His mother, Elizabeth, labored as a promotional leader and had elected to sustain her profession, not due to requirement, but because it maintained her involved, energetic, and linked to the environment beyond their residence. That day, restless and unoccupied, Josh roamed through the residence, seeking any diversion or task. Eventually, he arrived near the washing space where he noticed the container positioned just beyond the entrance, overflowing with recently cleansed and dried garments. At the uppermost position rested his personal items, arranged neatly the manner his mom perpetually organized them. Desiring to accomplish something beneficial for a change, he resolved to commence carrying his garments upward to store them appropriately. As he elevated his pile, however, his attention settled on something additional concealed just below. A gentle emerald satin underlayer edged entirely with refined lace. Without deliberation, he extended and permitted his digits to graze against the sleek material. The second he made contact, an unforeseen electric excitement surged through his complete physique, a feeling so powerful and unfamiliar that it left him temporarily immobile. Shocked by his personal response, Josh withdrew his hand and retreated from the container, heart racing as he attempted to comprehend what had just transpired. He hastened to store his personal garments in his chamber, assuring himself he would simply disregard touching the underlayer and proceed onward. Yet, the instant he completed, something drew him directly back to the washing region. He remained there gazing at the emerald item again, almost as though it were silently summoning him nearer. Breaking free from the peculiar, dreamy state, he bent downward, seized the underlayer by its slender bands, and gradually permitted it to unfold in his palms. Beneath rested the complete coordinating collection, a satin supportive top, matching undergarments, and a supporting belt, all in the identical rich emerald tone. Gathering the entire assortment into his arms, Josh sensed the refreshing, slick satin slide against his skin and limbs. In that instant, he understood profoundly and without doubt that he required to test these elements on. He moved quietly into his chamber, secured the entrance, and swiftly removed his everyday garments. Determining the supportive top would prove simplest if he fastened it in front initially. He performed exactly that, then rotated it around his rear and slid his limbs through the bands. Shaking with a blend of anxiety and thrill, he secured the supporting belt firmly around his midsection. Next arrived the undergarments. He stepped into them and gradually drew the silky material upward along his limbs until it settled perfectly against his form. Once the undergarments and underlayer were both positioned, an impulse struck him to view the complete result. He padded down the corridor to his mother's chamber, where the complete-length reflective surface stood on her bureau. He noticed a pair of transparent coverings lying prepared. He lifted them, savoring their remarkable gentleness between his digits, then seated himself on the border of her mattress to apply them. He had observed his mom perform this countless occasions through the gap of her mildly open entrance over the years. Now he copied every cautious motion he recalled, gently collecting the covering, directing his toes, sliding it smoothly over his foot and up the length of his limb, then attaching the edge securely to the supporting clips. He repeated the procedure with a second covering, then stood upright. The instant he did, he sensed the delightful strain as the coverings tugged lightly against the supports with every minor adjustment of his weight. With his somewhat lengthier locks and slim structure, the reflective surface displayed him somebody who appeared far more like an adolescent lady than the boy he recognized himself as. The single imperfection that immediately stood prominent was how the supportive top sections hung vacant and level against his torso. Without delay, He returned to the bureau, searched through the compartment, and selected several pairs of silky undergarments to fill into the sections. The instant he did, the form altered dramatically. He now possessed the appearance of genuine chest areas, and the view excited him. He moved to his mother's dressing table, seated himself, and commenced combing his locks gradually and systematically until they fell in gentler, more womanly waves around his features. Glancing back at the reflective surface, he sensed genuine contentment with what he viewed. The filled supportive top, the elegant underlayers hugging his form, the arranged locks framing everything. Pivoting aside briefly, he opened his mom's storage and commenced searching through rows of upper layers and lower garments. His digits soon located what he was hoping for, the golden satin evening gown she reserved for special occasions. He lifted it carefully from its hanger, the rich satin murmuring against itself as he did. The luxurious texture sent another wave of excitement through him. He slipped the gown over his head, eased his limbs into the short sleeves, and permitted the material to settle over his form. Reaching behind himself, he struggled a little, but eventually managed to close the rear all the way up. Nothing could have prepared him for how marvelous it felt to be enveloped entirely in his mother's satin items. Before stepping away from the storage, his eyes captured the matching golden 3-inch elevated footwear sitting neatly on the floor below. He lifted them, returned to the mattress, and seated himself carefully, sweeping the lower garment beneath him the manner he had seen his mom perform so many occasions. He eased one foot into the pointed toe of the pump and discovered, to his delight, that it suited perfectly. Once both elevated footwear were on, he took a few cautious moments to adjust to the fresh elevation and equilibrium before attempting to stand. When he finally rose, his limbs wavered at first, but he grasped the edge of the bureau for support until he found his balance. Then he commenced to take small, hesitant steps. Returning to the reflective surface once more, he examined the complete image. He not only sensed wonderful attired this way, he could view clearly that he appeared wonderful, too. The temptation to test grooming crossed his thoughts, but he knew his absence of proficiency might spoil the instant. Instead, he resolved to simply enjoy the exquisite feeling of satin sliding against his skin, saving complete womanliness for another occasion. That initial encounter lasted nearly 2 hours. Still entirely attired, he returned to his personal chamber and seated himself at his device, exploring digitally for anything he could locate regarding males who appreciated donning ladies' gowns and underlayers. He uncovered entire sites filled with accounts, informative pieces, and even discussion areas devoted to the topic, including one about something termed petticoat discipline. Eventually, he encountered a conversation space where males who cherished donning womanly garments gathered to discuss. Although he was underage, curiosity prevailed. When prompted for a screen designation, he paused only a second before typing Janet. In that instant, he decided that whenever he was attired like this, he would be Janet. He entered the conversation and commenced discussing with others who clearly shared the identical passion he had only just discovered in himself. Some were occasional crossdressers like him. Others described complete transformations directed by spouses, romantic partners, or authoritative figures. Each session concluded the identical manner: reluctant removal and an attempt to restore everything to its original condition, usually with small revealing signs that Elizabeth quietly observed every occasion. One particular dawn, before heading to labor, Elizabeth made a deliberate selection. She suspended a brand fresh white satin ankle-length sleeping gown complete with matching robe on the exterior of her sleeping chamber entrance. On her bureau, she arranged an entire fresh set of lacy white satin underlayers, supportive top, supporting belt, undergarments, along with black seamed coverings, all obtained specifically with her offspring in mind. On the floor beneath the suspended gown, she positioned a pair of fluffy, white slippers. Every element had been chosen for both its visual attractiveness and its irresistible tactile appeal. She hoped Josh Janet would find them impossible to resist. Later that afternoon, when Josh entered his mother's chamber to decide what to don, the sight of the pristine white negligee collection and underlayers halted him completely. Everything appeared as though it had been prepared especially for him, awaiting patiently. He was utterly enchanted, exactly as his mother had anticipated. He had always known his mom owned charming garments, but nothing had ever struck him as quite this exquisite before. The moment his digits brushed the satin of both the sleeping gown and the underlay set, he knew without doubt that Janet had to don them today. He gathered every element, including the coverings and slippers, and carried them back to his chamber. Attiring did not require long at all. The delicious materials felt even superior against the skin than he had imagined. Once fully attired, he returned to his mother's chamber to borrow a few pairs of undergarments to fill out the supportive top sections and to admire himself in the complete-length reflective surface, wearing the complete negligee and robe. Every step made him keenly conscious of the satin gliding around his limbs and torso, the gentle but constant tug of the coverings against the supporting clips. The feeling was heavenly, and it only deepened when he stuffed the supportive top and saw the gentle, womanly outlines staring back at him from the glass. Some of his digital conversation companions had mentioned utilizing a maxi pad inside their undergarments, not only for protection, but also to assist in creating a smoother, more convincingly womanly front. Curious, he slipped into the washing facility, located his mother's box of maxi pads under the basin, opened the package, peeled away the adhesive band, and positioned one carefully inside his undergarments. Walking with the pad in position felt peculiar, yet oddly correct, adding another layer to the experience of being Janet. Back in his chamber, he logged straight into the conversation space, eager to share what he was wearing with anyone who inquired. As he typed and shifted in his seat, he relished the firm embrace of the supportive top across his chest, the silky caress of the undergarments and sleeping gown against every inch of his skin. He became so deeply engaged in discussion with two other participants that he completely failed to hear the front entrance open or his mother's quiet footsteps moving through the residence. Elizabeth had deliberately taken only a half day at the office that afternoon, determined to confirm the suspicions that had been building for weeks. She slipped off her footwear at the entrance and padded silently toward Josh's chamber. Peering carefully around the doorway, she saw her offspring sitting there in the white satin negligee and robe, clearly immersed in the pleasure of being attired that way. Still unnoticed, she stepped closer and glanced at the device screen, reading both the chosen screen designation, Janet, and the content of the private discussions. Before she could speak, Josh sensed a faint movement behind him. He spun around in the seat and found his mother standing there, a warm, knowing grin on her face. Mortification flooded him instantly. His cheeks burned crimson as he longed to vanish entirely. He dropped his gaze to the floor, convinced the world was concluding and bracing himself for fury, disgrace, and penalty. Instead, Elizabeth walked over calmly and seated herself on the border of his mattress. In a gentle tone, she told him how attractive he appeared wearing the negligee. She even stated she wished she could have viewed Janet in some of her other preferred pieces, especially that golden satin evening gown. Then she inquired softly whether Janet was the designation he had selected for himself when attired like this. All Josh could manage was a small, embarrassed nod. Elizabeth smiled wider and stated Janet was a lovely designation that seemed to suit perfectly. Next, she inquired whether Janet enjoyed the feeling of gentle, silky garments against her skin. Overwhelmed, Josh finally found his voice and began stumbling through an apology, promising he would never touch her items again, swearing it was a single occasion error, begging forgiveness. He hadn't gotten very far before Elizabeth reached out, took both his palms in hers, and spoke quietly but firmly. She told him she had absolutely no objection with Josh or Janet attiring and presenting femininely. If this was what made him content, then she fully backed it. Her only real concern, she explained, was that Janet had been borrowing her garments without inquiring. Elizabeth believed it would be far superior and more respectful if Janet possessed her very own collection instead of continually utilizing items from her mother's storage. Of course, she added with a grin, Janet could still borrow anything she liked whenever the mood struck. Josh was speechless. He had braced himself for shouting, for insults, for complete rejection. Instead, his mother was offering acceptance, and not just acceptance, but encouragement to be Janet openly with her own garments and her own space. Moisture welled up and spilled down his cheeks as he looked into her smiling face and whispered, "Are you sincere?" Elizabeth nodded, opened her arms, and pulled Janet into a tight, comforting embrace. She stroked his locks gently while he wept quietly against her shoulder. When the sobs began to ease, she reached for a box of cloths so he could wipe his eyes. Then she posed the big question, would Josh like to exist as Janet full-time? He nodded eagerly, almost frantically, but immediately inquired how that could possibly function, especially with secondary education commencing in less than 2 weeks. Elizabeth explained that she had noticed the early signs of Janet's interest some time ago. Acting on her instincts, she had quietly investigated options and made inquiries. There was a private all-girls institution not far away that welcomed both traditional female attendees and those who presented as female, regardless of their assigned sex at birth. The school, Parkside High, sometimes nicknamed TGI High in certain circles because of the number of male attendees who attended while attired and living as ladies, would accept Josh as Janet, provided his academic records met their standards. She had already forwarded his transcripts and completed most of the application paperwork. The only remaining step was to add Janet's feminine designation to the forms, and acceptance would be guaranteed. From that point forward, Janet would attend school every day, attired fully in womanly garments, living authentically as a lady. Looking directly into his eyes, Elizabeth inquired whether this sounded acceptable. Janet's face illuminated with a radiant grin. She threw her arms around her mother and squeezed tightly, repeating, "Yes, yes, yes," over and over. After a moment, Elizabeth inquired playfully whether Janet would model the negligee for her. Perhaps give a little rotation. Janet stood immediately and turned slowly in place, while her mother admired how beautifully the pieces suited and how lovely they appeared. Then Elizabeth explained that she had acquired this entire collection, the sleeping gown, robe, underlayers, coverings, slippers, especially for Janet. They were the very initial items in what would become Janet's personal collection. Still processing the terms, Janet started to protest that these belonged to her mom, only to have Elizabeth gently interrupt and repeat that no, she had obtained them specifically for her daughter. The realization struck, and Janet's grin grew even brighter. She launched herself into another enthusiastic embrace. Elizabeth then inquired if Janet would mind elevating the hem of her negligee so she could view the undergarments, supports, and coverings underneath. Without hesitation, Janet raised the satin fabric daintily. Elizabeth immediately noticed the gentle feminine curve created by the maxi pad tucked inside the undergarments. She inquired about it with genuine curiosity. Blushing deeply, Janet explained that she utilized it both for protection and to assist in keeping everything neatly tucked and smooth. Her mother beamed with pride at how thoughtful and clever her daughter already was. She promised there would always be abundant maxi pads on hand for both of them from now on. Next, Elizabeth inquired whether Janet had selected a middle designation yet, since the school application required one. After only a brief pause, Janet looked up shyly and inquired if she could utilize Elizabeth as her middle designation in honor of her mother. The question nearly brought moisture to Elizabeth's eyes, but she held them back, pulled Janet close again, and hugged her fiercely. She then shared that she had already conversed confidentially with a trusted female legal professional acquaintance about the procedure of legally changing Josh's designation to Janet Elizabeth. The legal professional had assured her it could be managed quickly, discreetly, and without complication before the school year began. With that settled, Elizabeth suggested it was time for Janet to choose an ensemble for the day so they could head out together and commence shopping for the complete collection she would require. She also proposed that Janet start hanging her fresh garments in the spare sleeping chamber storage right away. That room would soon be properly furnished and decorated as an adolescent lady's sleeping chamber, complete with space for the device, so Janet could keep up with her digital companions and conversations. Elizabeth stepped out briefly to select a nice daytime ensemble for Janet to wear on their shopping excursion. While waiting, Janet carefully removed the negligee and slippers, folded them lovingly, and placed them in what was now officially her own storage. In that quiet moment, she sensed deep in her bones that this truly was the initial day of the rest of her fresh existence.